Let's just give him a moment to pop back in in case he's having difficulties. Sarah, I guess we'll go ahead and start, but maybe you could check in with him.
Yes.
All right. So welcome back and welcome to the Keynote opening roundtable. We're delighted to have with us today 4 cutting-edge scholars to inaugurate the Pop-Up Institute. They join us today from 4 different countries and time zones and 3 different disciplines. They'll engage in a discussion directly covering at least 4 of our research clusters, which Neville and I and Ali just described. In case you're just joining us anew, you can read about the clusters on our website, and Sarah Eliason will put in the chat now or when she has a moment, a link to that part of the website. So Aaron Benenov will focus today on AI and technology, Adele Blackett on care work, Juan de Lara on essential work, and Prabha Koteswaran on work across the global south. Although, as you'll see in our discussion, their work crosses over a variety of clusters, which will make for a great discussion. Now, I'll introduce them and the idea of the roundtable in a moment, but first, just some basic information on the Zoom meeting. So, as I mentioned, we did make this a Zoom meeting as opposed to a webinar, and have done so with all of our events to try to make them more interactive. So that they can also, so that the people in the audience during Q&A can speak if they like directly, although and ask your questions yourselves. For now, though, we would like to ask everyone except the roundtable participants to turn off your cameras and please ensure that your mics are muted. During the roundtable, you should feel free to type general comments to everyone in chat. So if there's a particular point that resonates and you want to shout it out, or one that doesn't and you want to disagree, you should feel free to do that. Since we aren't all great multitaskers, though, I would encourage you to send any questions for the panelists directly to me. And if you'd like to ask a question in person, please put, and we'll do this at the end, but please put an asterisk at the start of the question, which is basically saying, let me speak. And then it would be great if you could say who the question is for and its general topic. So Sarah will give an example. She just did, and we're glad to see you, Juan. Welcome. And she doesn't have the question for you yet, don't worry. But that would be an example of saying, I'd like to speak and ask Juan de Lara my question about pandemic capitalism. If you're watching from YouTube, and I know a number of people are, please enter your questions in the YouTube chat, and we have a student team member who will pass them along to me. So back to our speakers. As I said, this is the Rappaport's second time to welcome each of them. Indeed, they've been central to the Pop-Up Institute and heard about it when they first came, because each spoke last fall in our Rappaport Center colloquium, which is also part of an interdisciplinary seminar that we teach in the law school and that Michelle Kahn and I taught together. The seminar was entitled Inequality, Labor, and Human Rights, the Future of Work in the Age of Pandemic. And knowing that we would be doing the Pop-Up Institute, We sat down and we thought about who are the 4 people we are most eager to hear from to help us analyze critically some of the assumptions and prognoses of much of the future of work discussion. And these were our 4. Fortunately, they all said yes, and each came and engaged, some of you were there, in a public Zoom 2-hour session with faculty respondents from UT, as well as students in the seminar. But they came sequentially. So while we got to see them all, they didn't get to see each other. And we had many discussions in the class and among the pop-up researchers about the various ways in which their talks spoke to each other. And we fantasized many great conversations among them. But we thought that they'd probably do even a better job of having those conversations. And so we asked them to come together and speak to each other, if only virtually. And so once again, we asked, and once again, they all quite generously said yes. And we're so delighted that they are all here with us today. So I confess that it was only, so when we wrote them, we said, oh, and if you say you'll come, of course, we'll invite you back. And we thought we'll invite you back in person. And that's what we said in June. But we hadn't really quite, I confess, realized the extent to which their talks overlap so nicely with the various clusters. And my guess is that that's not coincidental. So their work on work and livelihood does divide neatly along the lines of our clusters, but also, as you'll see, many of them touch on more than one cluster. But we asked them to focus on one here, at least at the beginning, and then we'll start to have the conversation. So it turns out that alphabetically, they also line up with our clusters alphabetically. That I could say was truly coincidental, but it does make it easy for me to introduce them in that order. Now, in the interest of maximizing our time to hear from them, Sarah Eliason will drop their complete bios. I'm sure it's not their complete bios, but ones that we have into the chat. But I'll say something about what they'll be doing here today and how we see their work connected. So Aaron Beninoff is a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin. He's an economic historian whose research interests include 19th and 20th century global economic history, economic development, labor market dynamics, unemployment, and inequality. He spoke to us last fall on part of his then forthcoming book. So that's part of what's fun too. You've all done terrific things since you were here. And it's since been published by Verso in November 2020, titled Automation and the Future of Work. Since then, he's continued to publish, as have all. His most recent article, though, I think is worth mentioning, Technology-Focused Solutions Won't Work. That's the name of it, title of it, and it appeared in May 2021. He also has a forthcoming book entitled A World Without Work, Surplus Populations in the World Economy. Adele Blackett is Professor of Law and Canada Research Chair in Transnational Labor Law and Development, as well as founder and director of the Labor Law and Development Research Laboratory at McGill University. She teaches and researches in the areas of labor and employment law, trade regulation, law and development, and critical race theory. Last fall, she spoke to us on a draft of an article called Slavery is Not a Metaphor, U.S. Prison Labor and Racial Subordination Through the Lens of the ILO's Abolition of Forced Labor Convention, which has just been published this month. So congratulations on that, Adele. We've asked her today to focus on care work, at least at the beginning of the conversation, stemming in part from her award-winning 2019 book, Everyday Transgressions, Domestic Workers' Transnational Challenge to International Labor Law. Juan de Lara is Associate Professor in American Studies and Ethnicity and Director of the Latinx and Latin American Studies Center at the University of Southern California. A geographer by training, he researches and writes on social justice and social movements, urban political economy, race and ethnicity, Latinx geographies, and labor. He spoke to us in the fall, partly about his 2018 book, Inland Shift, Race, Space, and Capital in Inland Southern California, which uses Southern California's logistics economy to examine how modern capitalism was both shaped by and helped to transform the region's geographies of race and class. And he connected to that work to what was then a relatively new project he'd been engaged in on essential work and pandemic capitalism, which we asked him to begin his remarks on today. Prabha Koteswaran is professor of law and social justice at King's College London. She researches and writes in the areas of criminal law, transnational criminal law, feminist legal studies, and sociology of law, and much more. Much of her work considers the criminal regulation of work in the informal economy in India, including in the context of sex work and surrogacy. An example of some of that work is her award-winning book from 2011 entitled Dangerous Sex, Invisible Labor, Sex Work and Law in India. She spoke to us in the fall about the valuation of domestic labor in India, and that's work she's been continuing, including in discussions about the pandemic. Because much of her work is about India in a global context, we asked her to begin her remarks with discussion of the future of work across the global South. So that's our lineup. And to begin the discussion in the order of in which I introduced you all, I'd like to ask you each to start by talking to us for 4 to 5 minutes about how your work, basically the work related to the clusters we asked you to focus on, or how your work relates to them, and perhaps saying what you see as the biggest challenge or question in relation to that cluster topic. So we'll just go in the alphabetical order this round that I started, beginning with Aaron. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, great. And thank you, Karen, for inviting me. I'm really honored to be on a panel with such distinguished scholars. And I guess I'll just speak very briefly about AI and the future of work. So I recently published a book on automation and the future of work, which is a slight, related title, automation, AI, typically used as synonyms, but obviously some difference there. And it's clear, that we live in an age where at least we're talking all the time about brilliant technologies that have already come online and that appear to be coming online in the near future. That includes, of course, the internet, ubiquitous smartphones and social media, but also advanced forms of robotics, artificial intelligence, especially like machine and deep learning and neural networks, and of course, the emergent platform economy. And while these technologies have been coming online, we've also seen a number of disturbing labor market trends. We've seen higher average levels of unemployment and so-called jobless recoveries. Of course, we're living right now in a time when we've seen the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression, although of course not directly related to automation, obviously. We're also seeing higher rates of underemployment and pervasive economic insecurity, which has had very different effects on people across the labor market, especially racialized populations, less educated populations, and so on. And we're living in a time of rising inequality. So the big question is, what are the connections between these emergent technologies and these disturbing labor market trends? How are they connected to one another? And one of the starting points for my book was this explosion of discourse around this topic. People pointing out that, these new technologies essentially were responsible for what's going on. There's a very famous study by Frey and Osborne in 2013 that seemed to say that 47% of all jobs that exist today were going to be automated in some future time horizon, which wasn't specified. And studies since then have really shown that on a closer examination, those numbers turn out to be a little bit ambiguous, that a lot of jobs that Frey and Osborne thought would be automated were actually going to be transformed, but not fully automated away. And at the same time, we've seen a number of really important studies by other social scientists showing that new technologies are being implemented in ways that use a lot of labor and that rely on a lot of insecure labor for their operations, whether that's in the platform economy or all the kind of hidden labor behind apparently automated processes like content moderation, for example, on social media. And we've seen a lot of talk of digital forms of surveillance, of algorithmic management and control, and so on, that point to a very disturbing future in which there will be a lot of work to be done, but workers will find their autonomy really snatched away from them. So my work's really focused on some of the broader conditions that have made for bad work in the digital age. It's not just a story. I think we can't just talk about labor in the digital economy and the future of AI and automation and so on. We have to look at the broader economic conditions into which this new digital economy is inserted. And I think some really important points to note are the paradox that this age of brilliant new technologies has also been an era of pretty significant economic slowdown, what economists have been calling secular stagnation, that we live in a stagnating economy in spite of the apparent rapid change in technology. And then in fact, economic statistics suggest that instead of rapid labor productivity growth, which we would expect to see if all of these workers were being replaced with machines and the remaining workers were producing more and more per hour, instead of that, we're seeing really a slowdown in productivity growth. And so big questions are like, why is this slowdown happening? But in any case, my view is that the slowing growth, as well as the efforts states have made to try to restore growth in this era of stagnation, are really responsible for a more general condition of insecurity, which is also why insecurity pervades so much of the digital economy. I'm very doubtful of the PR claims that Silicon Valley executives make about their technologies and the capabilities that are about to come online. And I think that more and more scholars in the era of this kind of tech lash are similarly doubting those claims and trying to figure out what's really going on with work in the economy today. I think as Karen mentioned, there's a lot of reasons to believe that work in the future will look a lot like work already in the past and the present. And so I guess, running out of time here already with a very short initial presentation, I think that some other big questions we need to investigate, which link to the other panels, is like, what does the future of the digital economy look like globally, not just in rich countries like the United States? What kinds of technology, what kinds of transformations that we've seen during the pandemic are really going to continue into the post-pandemic age, which may or not be coming up on our horizon? And also, I think we should be talking not only about the harms that people are experiencing within the digital economy today, but also what the possibilities are for a very different world that new technologies afford. So I'll just leave it at that and turn it over to the other panelists. Thank you so much.
Great. Terrific way to get us into the conversation. Adele, you want to talk to us about care work?
Great. So thank you very much, Karen and team, for the invitation to come back. And just wanted to express my gratitude for the care and thought that's put into fostering ongoing conversations around these themes. So the theme I've been asked to speak to is work and care. And I tend to start by underscoring invisibility. First, the invisibility of the work, right? Cooking, cleaning, taking care of children and others who require support. The work is often unpaid. And when it's paid, it is usually poorly paid. The work is perpetual. It is boundaryless. There are few artifacts. A clean child is not clean for long. The work is unseen until it is undone. And I often turn to a domestic worker of Moroccan heritage in France, Fatima El Ayoubi, about whom a wonderful film was produced a few years ago. And she referred to her own work as art, but that transpires through her very body, takes from her body as she works long hours every day, 7 days a week to make ends meet. But it's her ability to underscore how unseen that work is and how unseen she is as a worker in that work that is crucial. And so, of course, there is very significant theorizing about the care economy. I want to focus, in light of my discipline, on the way that we think about the law of the household workplace, the normative order that thinking about care, paid or unpaid, in this manner holds in place. And then the ways in which the workers who do that work challenge their own invisibilization, right? Insist on being seen, insist on challenging the normative order that is they're expected to operate within. So the women, as I've alluded to in the example of Fatima El Ayoubi, racialized, gendered, nationality does a lot of work here in respect of global migration. And what is striking is that although much of the early care economy work emphasized the relationship between reproductive labor to so-called productive labor, and the framing through the household economy, there was an erasure of the very specificity of those required to work, either enslaved, so without pay, or poorly paid. And that is the racialization. If the household economy model holds, it holds in a particular understanding of those held in servitude in that relationship. And until we grapple with the ways in which that subordination it remains embodied in the workers, we will not properly unravel the disparity in pay that accompanies that work. So deeply intersectional work, and part of what remains invisible and must be challenged. That racialization, that gendering, then inscribes certain understandings of the law that governs the workplace. The worker is not to be seen. The worker is not to be heard. The worker's needs are not to be seen, are not to be taken into account. Sometimes this seemed a little remote and hard to explain. And here's where I intersect with the next speaker. The pandemic has placed this invisibility so squarely before us. We actually talk about essential workers, those who literally keep our markets going and keep us alive. And yet the consequence isn't to say, therefore, they need decent working conditions, they require social justice, but instead, we can take. We can expect these workers to put themselves at risk to their lives, to their families' lives. And there's such deep continuity in that, in the way that we think about the subordinated service of care workers. And so if I may bridge with Erin's presentation, it really is that old forms of work and understandings of the relationship of workers to the economy and to our legal regimes retain their vitality and transform themselves in new contexts, but they don't really disappear. And so we need to understand the underlying subordination. Thanks.
Great. I think that Adele just gave you the segue, Juan.
Thank you so much, Karen and Neville, for inviting me again. And I'm happy to see you all. And thank you, Adele, for that lovely segue. And Aaron, I'm really enjoying your book. So I'm happy to read that. I think that I just want to start with the point that Adele just made, which is that this idea that the pandemic made essential workers visible. And I think that, if we read through what Adele was also saying, is that, of course, these workers have always been there, and that these workers have always been essential to the work of capitalism. And it's just a question of understanding that in particular kinds of historical moments, that these workers are placed in precarious conditions, and especially during a time like pandemic that we're living through now, that sort of the pandemic creates these situations that make their work and their lives even more precarious than they have been in the past, right? And so to understand that, one, when I talk about essential workers, one of the points that I'm making is that this is not an exceptional concept, that essential workers are not only essential during a time of pandemic capitalism or during the time of a pandemic, that essential workers, have been the life and blood of the way that capitalism has established itself as a global system throughout generations. And so I want to just sort of very quickly talk about three different points that I think connect and explain my approach, both to what I said when I first joined you all, Karen, and talked about essential workers, and then some of the prompts that you sent me in terms of possible questions that you might ask me for today. And I just want to begin by sort of focusing on that phrase, essential capitalism. What does that mean? And when I speak about pandemic capitalism, when I speak about pandemic capitalism, I want to make sure that we pay attention to three particular issues. One is the pervasiveness of capitalism, right? That written into the logics of capitalism is a demand for growth and accumulation. So pervasiveness is key to understanding, how pandemic capitalism works. And closely tied to that is this idea that capitalism has always been global. That part of the work that has been done, especially by scholars in the global South, is to destabilize the mythos of capitalism as the product of an Enlightenment project, right? That is based on rationality and liberal democracy. That instead of thinking about capitalism as an equivalent to freedom and liberty, that we should think about how capitalism has been built on global imperialism and on the blood, land, and labor of racialized bodies, right? And so the third point, so we talked about pervasiveness, written into the logics of growth, globalism, that capitalism, in fact, has always been imperial and extractive. And then the third part is to think about pandemic capitalism as deadly, as a way to think about how the essential, or this idea that workers or resources are essential to the growth of global capitalism, provides a rationale for people and places to be rendered as sacrificial, right, in particular places. And one of the things that I've been focusing on in this idea, in this sort of work that I've been doing on logistics and essential workers during the time of the pandemic, is the way that the state has created the regulatory frameworks that have enabled precarious labor to function, right? and for the production of disposable communities, disposable workers, etc., that we have to understand, again, not the exceptional process or the exceptional moment of a pandemic, but in fact, how this is part and parcel of the logics of global capitalism, right? And so in my particular work, I focused a lot on thinking about the regulatory frameworks that have consistently created what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the anti-state state, in which the defunding of the regulatory apparatus of the state means that there are less resources, less funds available for places to be monitored. For example, much of the work that's happened around the expansion of places like Amazon and Walmart and these global retailers who use logistics workers in these warehouses, one of the things that's been pretty clear to me in my research is that this is able to happen. Workers are hurt because of the rigorous quota systems that are implemented by companies like Amazon and Walmart. But also within the workplace, many workers are not actually enjoying the benefits of a regulated labor system. They don't have the same kinds of labor protections, not because the protections don't exist in law, but because the state has been so disarmed, right, by defunding, that there aren't enough inspectors to go in and regulate and monitor and make sure that workers are actually safe on the job. And it's only in moments, in places like in California, where progressive groups have organized and really forced the regulatory state to enforce the existing laws, where we see state officials going in, inspecting these places, and then fining companies millions and millions of dollars because of the kinds of health and safety violations that are routine and a regular part of everyday life at the job for companies like Walmart and Amazon. And so this idea, again, of pandemic capitalism is to think about, it's not a new thing, but what it is, it's a way to frame capitalism the way that it always has been, which is pervasive, which is global, and which is also deadly, right? And so I think about the pervasiveness of precarity, the globality of understanding how some economies have used both biophysical resources, meaning labor and natural resources, as systems of accumulation and growth, right? This is the whole foundation of world systems theory. And of course, thinking about the deadly consequences of the expansion of pandemic capitalism. And I'll just end here with saying that part of the project that I engage in and why I insist on talking about capitalism in this way is because I don't think that we can talk about capitalism without talking about imperialism and without talking about racialization. And I will also add, of course, to this heteropatriarchy, right? And so we understand capitalism in these contexts, within these terms. And frankly, I think that, yes, we can talk about racial capitalism, but I actually prefer just to talk about capitalism and understand that when I say capitalism, I mean capitalism in this kind of pandemic sense, but also in this kind of racial capitalism sense, right? That we understand the global infrastructures, the global relationships of power that have always been present in the expansion and development of capitalist systems. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Juan. And in a little bit, I want to get others to think too about the theoretical underpinnings and how they're similar and different from the ones you just described. Prabha, there is still much left to be said. So I think everyone's talked about at some level or touched upon work across the Global South, but we'll give you a chance to dive in a bit more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen and Neville, for this invitation. And it's as Aaron said, it's a real privilege to share this space with all of you wonderful, brilliant scholars. So yeah, I mean, so what I'm about to say will have some overlap with what Adele has said and what Juan has said. But also there are some differences. So I think, I'll kind of speak about both the similarities and the differences. So my research is on women's work in the global South context of India, and I'm particularly interested in looking at social reproduction. I use the vocabulary of social reproduction rather than of care, but really social reproduction involves the labor inherent in biological reproduction and voluntary work, in the reproduction of culture and ideology, and the provision of a range of services, sexual, emotional, and affective. So in a sense, it very much overlaps with what Adele has told us in terms of certain characteristics of care work, of reproductive labor. And as she rightly pointed out, I think earlier on there was early literature in this area really spoke about the connection between reproductive labor and productive labor. But I think even there, the missing link was to look at reproductive labor which was performed for the market, which is something that feminists didn't necessarily embrace early on. So I'm really thinking here about forms of reproductive labor that span the market marriage continuum, and that's what I'm really interested in. So the question is, the challenge has been for feminists to agree on whether there are certain forms of reproductive labor performed for the market, whether they can ever be work. So as Karen has already mentioned, I've been looking at a range of market-based forms of reproductive labor, including sex work, erotic dancing, and commercial surrogacy, which are often characterized as some form of violence and therefore subject to carceral state responses. And when it comes to paid domestic work, of course, it's a story of utter neglect and precarity. So the goal is really for me to start from women's lived experiences on what they think of as work, and then map some of the existing discourses of such work, including by women workers themselves, because they perform a lot of boundary work when they're trying to destigmatize certain forms of work. And when we come to the marriage side of the continuum, I think there is unpaid domestic and care work, which actually, as all the speakers have said, the pandemic has really sharply rendered visible as being quite fundamental to any kind of paid work that we might do for the economy, but also just to the sustenance of life itself. But even here, I think, unpaid domestic and care work is seen as detracting from valuable work. So in the context of the global South, and particularly here, I'm thinking of India, there is a serious problem, quote unquote, of declining female labor force participation rates. And this is posed as a problem by several international organizations and donor bodies who explain this declining labor force participation in terms of the burdens of unpaid care and domestic work, and then is explained away in terms of, cultural factors and, backwardness of some sort or the other. So of course, the problem here, we need to turn it around, turn it on its head to say that actually the problem is not just that, women perform disproportionate amounts of unpaid work, but really they also perform unpaid economic activities which are not recognized by the state as work when you think of, census and labor force surveys and so on. So what is at the core of this discussion is really what is work and who gets to call, term certain forms of economic activity as work. And here I just want to say a little bit about, because everyone has spoken a little bit about the law, I just want to also sound a note of optimism, which is that, when we try and dislodge and query these hegemonic ways of thinking about women's work, we also need to appreciate the contingency of the rule networks that shape them. So actually, one of the things that I discussed in my paper in the fall was really around how a common law rule around compensation for loss of life under tort law was radically reinterpreted by Indian courts. So, typically when a homemaker died, there would be compensation for her family in terms of loss of love and affection, loss of consortium. Sometimes courts don't award any compensation because they simply think that her work within the home is a labor of love, and therefore, it should not be commodified. But what Indian courts did was to really take this common law rule and reinterpret it in a way that they read women's unpaid domestic and care work in terms of loss of services. So they brought it under a pecuniary category of compensation and then viewed it as an occupation effectively, so that they could assign a monthly payment for it and then, multiply it over the lifespan of the woman. So there is this very interesting way in which women's unpaid work has been recognized by Indian courts and is at the tipping point of being constitutionalized. So we can constitutionalize this recognition of social reproduction. So I'll say a little bit about work in the Global South now in terms of challenges. And I think the main challenge really is, apart from uncovering this, this literature on what do we mean by work, is trying to understand the complex and shifting terrain of relations between the state, labor, and capital. And here, obviously, the Global South, many parts of the Global South have been subject to neoliberal economic policies through structural adjustment policies. But what is paradoxical is, certainly in the case of India, is not a retraction of the welfare state. If anything, there's been an expansion of the welfare state with the advent of neoliberal capitalism, including through quite radical redistributive programs such as employment guarantee schemes and laws that institutionalize socioeconomic rights such as the right to education and food security. So I guess anyone trying to understand work in this Global South context has to confront this paradox, really. And one way in which it has been explained is that gains from the formal corporate sector, or what is termed as the accumulation economy, will be routed through the welfare state to those in the informal economy or who are in the need economy to ensure political legitimacy. And often we find that workers also subscribe to this understanding by resorting to what Reena Agarwala calls social movement unionism, where they don't necessarily negotiate with their employers, but they really negotiate with the state for meeting their reproductive needs in terms of housing, education, and health. So, of course, the shifts due to the pandemic, and India is still in the throes of the second wave, has simply meant that, this bargain between the state and capital and labor has undergone yet again another shift, and it's too soon to say what this might look like. But all we know, is that estimates say that 200 million people are now below the poverty line compared to earlier. So 200 million more people being under the poverty line, and the migration of workers back to rural areas from the urban areas because they simply cannot meet their reproductive needs in the urban areas. So these are massive job losses, both for women and for men. So the question is, how do we reimagine work in the post-pandemic period? Thanks.
Well, I think you all have stated enough challenges for us to deal with for 3 weeks. And hopefully we'll be able to continue beyond that. So thank you all very much for touching on many issues that we've been thinking about a lot, and some new ones as well. I'm going to encourage, I think the best way to have, I'd like to have a little bit of discussion among you all, because I know, and I really appreciate the way you've brought in your responses to the speakers before you as well. So Prabha, obviously I was going to ask you about your focus on domestic work and unpaid work and the various calls for reform that you've been engaged with. But I want to stick with the Global South for a moment. Because I heard a tension between Juan's discussion, or maybe it's not a tension, but he talked about the anti-state state in the United States, and you talk about the expanding social welfare state in the Global South. And I'd like to pull in Aaron a little bit on this, because I think sometimes you've suggested that actually there is no welfare, there's much less of a welfare state in the Global South. And of course, these are huge categories and they depend on what North and what South we're thinking about. But really all of your work touches on the role of the Global South in the kinds of economic policies and that you discuss. And maybe I'll just ask the others, the easiest thing, you could either raise your hand when you want to jump in, or you can send me a chat and say, I'd like to speak to so-and-so about such and such. So this is for the participants now, and I'd be happy to do that. So Aaron.
Oh, so sorry. What you just want me to respond to the other, or respond to what you were saying?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay, and sorry, I meant to say for the panelists to send me your when you want to jump in. I thought that you might have a different take on the welfare state in the Global South, or at least in some parts of the Global South, as well as the Global North, from Juan's anti-state state. idea?
Yeah, I think these are really fascinating questions. And of course, the welfare state has many different components, right? And we've seen them maybe move in contradictory ways as well, with states introducing some, especially in the global south, conditional cash transfers and other forms of cash-based welfare programs, while at the same time trying to like flexibilize labor markets and introduce insecurity in different ways into different sectors of the market. So I think it's really complicated. And I think that those complications have to do, I actually really thought what Prabha said about the development of the welfare state in the global south and the kinds of efforts on the part of political parties to kind of draw some of the wealth being accumulated in the corporate sector towards the rest of the population in order to support their own kind of political fortunes. I think we're just seeing a lot of contradictory dynamics, because I think the two sides of it are, on the one hand, the need to kind of get mass votes, and on the other hand, the need to support ongoing accumulation in incredibly difficult economic times. I mean, we've just seen in the course of the past 20 years, 2 once-in-a-lifetime global economic crises, right? And I think that, you know, I guess what I focused on in my work is the way that, especially in turbulent economic times, when corporate actors are able to sort of say, we're not sure that we can invest in this environment. We're concerned about investment possibilities. We're concerned about a bad business climate. Governments have been forced, whether they are, you know, I mean, look at the long history of social democratic governments in Europe. Look at the German Social Democratic Party implementing all of these hard sphere reforms in 2004 that really reduced workers' access to unemployment benefits. So even parties that nominally are parties that are supposed to support the working class find that they kind of have to support businesses. They have to support or try to convince wealthy individuals and corporations to invest in the economy. And they often end up doing that in different ways at the expense of maybe sections of the workforce and so on. So I think we're just seeing a lot of contradictory trends that have to be analyzed, and trying to pick out the global story while also paying attention to north-south divides and regional divides and so on. I think it's a really interesting time. I thought something that really connected across the different speakers that I thought was really interesting is just about the limit related to this topic, is like the limits of the regulatory state, and the ways that sometimes what we see is that when the state, even when the state tries to regularize certain conditions, like for example, offering unemployment benefits or something like that, it can often cause large parts of the economy to kind of disappear from those, from, you know, like a lot efforts at regulation sometimes have contradictory effects as parts of the economy sort of withdraw from visibility to the state in various ways. And, you know, that's as much about individuals trying to survive at the bottom of the labor market in the global economy as it is about business strategies that prey on all kinds of vulnerable people at the bottom of the labor market. So I think, yeah, in different ways, I guess I'm really interested in questions that were raised about visibility and invisibility, the limitations both of the regulatory state and the statistical apparatus to kind of measure what's really going on under those conditions, and maybe just the general kind of the difficult environment for investment that's put a lot of power in the hands of the investment class and subordinated a lot of what governments can, you know, might be able to do in some abstract sense to these complicated articulations of business needs and the need to kind of create jobs and so on in a very difficult economic environment. So I'll stop there, but I found what all of you said is very, the other panelists said, very interesting. And I guess I'm, yeah, looking for connections, of which there are actually quite a lot in what we're doing. So thank you.
Yeah, and I'd say a lot of what we're focusing on in other events that are sort of connected to Under the Global South, a lot of it is on labor migration. Every one of you is talking about labor migration, and also the informal economy, and being very aware of the ways in which it operates in the global north as well as the global south, very much in the area in which Juan works. Adele or Juan, do you all want to jump in on Global South or response to care, or anything, any other challenges from the clusters you'd like to point to? Adele?
Yeah, happy to jump in. Very much appreciated the comments and the links. And one of the things I've kind of wanted to underscore, and I think it comes through beautifully in Prabha's presentation, and in relation, frankly, to Juan's, is that in labor, when we think about work, we've tended to think about very particular patterns of social protection, of labor regulation, that stem from epistemic models that are very much rooted in the global north and its perceived relationship to the development of the rest of the world, right? And other forms of work, including in the informal economy, which is, of course, such a broad way of talking about a range of organization of livelihoods. And what comes through, there's a long version of this discussion, but the short form is that we need to break from that assumption of path dependency and look very carefully, take our analytical starting points from specific places and specific groups of actors in the global South. And so the emphasis on social movement unionism captures some of that in the domestic work discussion. To bring it to labor, there was such surprise that the progressive innovation on how to regulate domestic work came mostly from specific places in the global South. And here I'll just segue to the racial capitalism discussion, because one, I very much hear you and tend to agree about claiming the broader discourse about what we mean when we affirm the particular mode of production and understanding of that organization through capitalism. And racial capitalism isn't a form. It is, in its fullness, an argument about how capitalism emerged and how it developed. And you'll note that I'm quite specific about naming slavery in relation to that, which centuries long system of economic ordering of the world that enabled the emergence of capitalism and enabled settler colonialism and overlapped with the emergence of colonialism, and very much was about imperialism. And so it's critical to put that form of labor, of course, broader human dehumanization, but labor is really quite critical. That the understanding of labor and land that comes through framing these matters this way allows us to see so much more, and to see the point that you led with, which is that capitalism is global. Right? So deep interconnections here, and I don't think we don't do ourselves a service unless we start the discussions with an understanding of the South, and of course the South of the North, and how those links then lead us to a different discussion about distribution or redistribution, right? So who the actors are in relation to work, and also whether we should be thinking about social protection in terms of international solidarity, in terms of alternative forms of distribution, which may be regional as well, and may be woven into the new legal architecture being developed to that builds polities, so trade, regional agreements, the like.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adele. I think that was totally agree with you on that. You know, it's always one of the things, because maybe it's because I'm a geographer, I always think about commodity chains and sort of thinking about how these things are structured on a global scale, right? Where do these resources, the things that go into the production of these goods, where are these things made, who is distributing them, and how are they being consumed, right? And all of the labor that's involved in each one of those steps, I think it's really critical for us to understand. But let me just sort of focus on one thing, and that's this question about the role of the global South and the state. And I want to just highlight the way that the global South, and I think Adele said this, the global South, or the South in the North, right? That's absolutely critical to understand the way that we think about racial capitalism within the United States, right? That racialization has functioned as a way to create these exploitable, precarious communities that can then be exposed to certain kinds of sacrificial labor, right? So let me give you one concrete example. What we know, from the beginning, when there was legislation, when we started talking about immigration and immigration policies, the construction of those policies were based on the racialization of both Asian, Chinese migrants, but also of Mexicans. To the point where when there was an established process to import Mexicans for agricultural labor, they were set aside. They were put in an exceptional category where they did not receive the same kinds of labor protections that other workers did, right? And this also includes, of course, the right to join unions, etc. That had to be set aside in the nation of the public, for the sort of sake of the public good, and the public here meaning a US consumer market, right, that was going to consume those goods. So from the beginning, the production of Mexican imported agricultural labor has always been tied to their production as an exploitable sacrificial labor force. And I say that because those conditions that they were exposed to, both coming to the United States, being sprayed with DDT, and then being exposed to countless pesticides and terrible living conditions and working conditions, were written into the code of, the law of the state, in order to render them usable, exploitable labor for the public good of the United States, right? So what happens during this, pandemic capitalism, where many of these same things are happening? For example, there were many cities that passed legislation that benefited essential workers by giving them essential work risk pay, right? And some companies did that. And in California, there was one city that tried to do that for farm workers, right? I think there were actually more, but the one city that I'm involved in is because it's a city that I'm from. I grew up in the city of Coachella in Southern California. My family were farm workers. I spent a lot of time working in those fields. The city of Coachella decides that farm workers should be included in the essential wages legislation that was passed by the local city. The Growers Association has taken them to federal court using those same federal laws, saying, no, farm workers are excluded from these kinds of labor protections. They represent a different class because of the interest of the federal, of the American public, right? Because they're using the same kind of infrastructure, legal infrastructure that has always created farm workers as an exploitable class, right? And so this is being heard now in the court, in federal court. But I raise that to say that when I'm talking about the anti-state state, this is part of what I'm talking about, the way that the state is used. And of course, always, and I think Aaron acknowledged it, that when we talk about the state in the United States, it is complicated because we have a federalist system in which there are many iterations of the state that is very different from the centralized states and the social welfare state of Europe, etc., right? But I think what has happened is that the state, and here I'm talking about the local state, has always been up for political contest between the interest where white, capitalists organize in order to capture the local state, in order to produce a particular state that enables them to develop systems and labor market systems, et cetera, that allows them to grow capitalism. Final point that I want to make. That also includes regulatory laws that make these communities where workers live, not just where they work, but where they live, susceptible to the ravages of things like environmental injustice, right? And so we can think about these same communities where local laws are also, we think about development, zoning, et cetera, where the state is actually also planned as a way to say, well, these communities are available for these kinds of polluting systems. And so when I talk about the anti-state state, I'm also talking about that. The way that regulatory agencies are used at multiple levels, right? And here, local, regional, state, et cetera, to produce these kinds of precarious, not only workplaces, but precarious communities in which people have to live their everyday lives, right? So that's sort of, I just wanted to highlight what I meant about that. And when I'm also, I think the other point is that we also need to think about the way that racialization works in the historical way that ideas about race and the global north vis-a-vis the global south is in play here. Because sometimes those relationships extend to the United States importing cheap labor from the global south, the same way that it imports resources from the global south in order to produce these kinds of goods. So I think that kind of wider framework is really important to understand and to recognize.
Thank you for, actually all of you have now segued to a question that I've been dying to ask you all. And since your first mention of the anti-state state one, so I think that clarification was really useful, because you've all mentioned law or regulation in some way in your comments. And I would have said at the beginning, Juan, that you talked about law as something that was not functioning, right? When your first example of lack of particular types of occupational health safety regulation. And I was going to ask, is law also part of the problem? And you just outlined beautifully a way in which law is part of the problem. And Prabha, you just touched upon it in your comments. You said you think there's reason to be optimistic about law. And so I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that. And then I'd like to ask each of you, before we open it up to the audience for a bit, I'd like to ask each of you to what you see the role of law in the, we'll say, in capitalism, or whatever you see as the greatest impediment to emancipation.
Great. So yeah, I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed Juan's exposition on the role of the state and, sort of conditioning social reproduction. What are the conditions of social reproduction for workers themselves? That's something that we often forget. And I think he outlined very beautifully what us as legal realists would say, you don't just deal with the law that you see in front of you, which is, you just don't look at labor law when you think of workers, but you really think about, what are the rules in the background? And the rules in the background are exactly the zoning laws, which, make workers live in, conditions that are uninhabitable, So I think this kind of flipping of the categories of different backgrounding, different sets of rules is what gives us hope, which is why, I made the point about contingency. But I think I just wanted to say, so law is definitely in its contingency, I think we can find opportunities for change. But I wanted to connect it back to what one said in terms of how the state operates. And just to say that, just as, you've all pointed out to the existence of the global South and the global North, I wanted to say a little bit about the global North and the global South, just to, complete the loop in terms of the law. And I think also it was interesting that one talked about the federal kind of the allocation of powers between different levels of government. I think it's really important, and it connects to what Adele said in terms of how some of the most innovative kind of regulatory mechanisms came from the global South. And it's not just the global South, it actually comes from the regional level, from the local level. Certainly in the Indian context, some of the best laws, even the radical kind of employment guarantee scheme, started out decades ago at the state level, which then, because of the federalist system, gets copied by other states and then gets, uploaded, so to speak, to the federal level. But at the same time, I think the pressures of international discourse around these issues. So certainly in the context of labor rights, and this question of trafficking, for example, there's a way in which some very innovative labor laws from the global south get appropriated by a larger carceral discourse around, say, trafficking, which replaces the labor law innovations with criminal law diktats. And I think the global north and the global south plays a very important role in downloading some of these sort of transnational carceral mechanisms, because it reinforces the power of the state. So I think it's just this very complex interplay of the state at the various levels and the laws at the various levels, which I think are very, very interesting to note for our purposes.
Great. I guess maybe I should call on the other law professor next, and then we'll hear from the historian.
So happy to go next, though. My point is actually going to be a historical one. As you were speaking, Prabha, I really like your framing of the downloading of carceral discourse, and this is not new. And so coming back to the way we reframed the law of slavery was precisely that, right? So law in the book, slavery is abolished, turn of the century, right? Nobody has it except illiberal states in what we will now call the global south, former colonies or those resisting colonization like Abyssinia or Ethiopia. And the framing was to draw on the model of the abolition, the Wilberforce, rather than the centuries of basically legally enforced subordination, exploitation, dehumanization. And then that enabled the turning of colonial machinery onto the other. And I think we should be nimble about those moments of through which the law was relied upon to shift quite fundamentally the kind of power that would be exercised over the other, right? And acknowledge how similar some of that can be, so yes, a deep reckoning with law's indeterminacy, and an insistence on historicizing that to underscore the point is what characterizes the way that I grapple with this question. And I'll just add that I absolutely agree that the specificity, taking the time to understand the specificity of law in place, then allows you to build a vision of law that flows as much through the resistances to how law is being characterized, but also reads resistance into our understanding of law. So a deeply pluralist or legal pluralist understanding of how law is both challenged but also constructed.
Great. And Erin, I know you have a lot to say about capitalism. And so I'd love to hear a little bit, get you in on this discussion about racial and pandemic capitalism, as well as your thoughts on the role of law in that.
Great, yeah. I mean, I guess one of the contexts in which I've studied this in particular is the erosion of labor law, really not only in the global north, but in the global south as well over the last 40 or 50 years. And I guess that I think that it really shows in a certain sense how even under conditions in which, in the middle of the 20th century, you had a real effort to kind of build up a labor regulatory framework to regularize employment relations, which was as much in the interests of, obviously, of labor as it was of capital, was perceived to be, at least in a certain limited way, to be the interests of capital. And I'm really interested in the ways that that erosion took place. And I guess that in my view, too often, that situation is explained purely as a result of a kind of power struggle, like somehow in the 80s, capital got the upper hand in the kind of war between capital and labor and just started imposing all of these incredibly insecure conditions on workers. And I think what that misses is the kind of autonomy or semi-autonomy, as it were, of the accumulation process itself, that when accumulation starts slowing down, not only do businesses suffer from low profit rates, but so too do workers, because hiring slows down, unemployment rates rise, governments fear that high unemployment will reduce their election chances, and there's a kind of general subordination of society, its various ends and goals to the need of capital. And I guess that's why, in my view, I mean, obviously we could talk about all of the ways that law supports a society with massive wealth inequalities and kind of structures the persistence of those inequalities over time, how it structures the really narrow number of people who have a say over shaping the very broadest questions about our future, what kind of investments we'll make in our society, how we will reallocate resources across the economy, what share of resources will flow through public channels while somehow really always remaining subordinated to the needs of private investment. And so sort of trying to transition maybe or include from a conversation about law and the possibilities of legal regulatory frameworks to kind of shape patterns of accumulation. I think that's definitely true, but the reverse also takes place, right? That legal frameworks are themselves in turn reshaped by the needs of capital. And, maybe just the most recent, version of this is, on the one hand, I was sort of surprised, I have to admit, that Uber and Lyft won so handily the California AB 22 fight, and that is now setting the stage for a kind of broader fight to really regularize massive insecurity and precarity in the platform economy, right? To write the rules in the favor of those companies. And also just the general way that I think we live in a time where I'm a little suspicious of a lot of the attention on AI ethics frameworks today, insofar as they seem to be basically purchased by Silicon Valley, companies that are seeking to create a kind of positive framework for the rollout of their technologies that are really going to be profitability based. They're trying to kind of preempt a lot of the criticism, or trying to dampen those criticisms by creating a kind of ethical framework for discussion of that. And I guess that, like, in my view, what we need to do is we need to shift, to a world, a very different world in which big decisions about the reshaping and shaping of our society are not only more public, because I think there's a big discussion happening now in the US around public investment, but also taking those kind of decisions out of the hands of government technocrats and corporate actors and their influences over the public sphere, and really trying to democratize the institutions of society. How do we produce a world in which there's a lot more democratic control over how we use our existing set of resources to transform human possibilities? And I think that would require a really dramatic restructuring of society. It would require a very different understanding of the relationship between law and investment, for example. And it would open up many more positive possibilities for redressing the harms in our society. For example, directing large parts of our productive capacities towards redressing, both in the countries that we live in and globally, reparations for slavery, reparations for colonialism and imperialism, trying to use global resources in a fair and just way to both mitigate and adapt to and try to reverse in whatever way we can climate change. The need to take public control and democratize that control over investment is something that I think, you know, I'm sort of hoping will be something that comes more clearly into view and will shape maybe some of these discussions about the emergent or possible relationships between law, regulation, and investment, and kind of trying to defeat the way that investment decisions, which really are the main thing shaping our lives, the way that those are controlled by a very small number of people and motivated by profitability, and the way that that's so limited with respect to the many different ends that we have, the plural, you know, in a pluralistic or possibly pluralistic future world. So I don't know, trying to bring in a few different ideas there, but I'm finding what the other panelists are saying so stimulating. Yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation.
Great. I would anyone from the audience want to chime in for a few minutes? I have one last big question for everyone, but we could take a couple of comments, questions, but someone would need to either turn their camera on and shout it out, or write me. All right, well, we have one question, which is actually, is putting gender back at the front, which I think is good because most of you have touched upon it, but we haven't had a chance to discuss in detail. So the question is, we've heard a fascinating discussion of care work and the gendering of this work. Do you see significant differences in how racialized and, in Juan's words, heteropatriarchal pandemic, I guess this would be how racial capitalism and heteropatriarchal pandemic capitalism has impacted workers in a, quote, male gendered industry such as construction? The question went a different direction than I thought. Anybody want to jump in on that? And that comes from Sabrina Barton at the Rappaport Center, who is bringing that up in large part because we've been doing a lot of work with construction workers. And there she is.
Can I just say something really quickly?
Yeah.
So I don't know about construction much because I don't study construction, but I think it's, you know, one of the things, and I forget who said it, one of my fellow panelists said, just thinking about I think it was Adele, talked about thinking about historical specificity, right? And the way that various kinds of markets, various kinds of sectors of capital function. One of the ways that I write about gender in my book is just thinking about how many of the companies that I write about in terms of logistics have used gender as a way to create precarity for women within the workplace. And I spend a lot of time talking about that in my writing. And I think it's critically important and to talk about that in terms of the workplace. But of course, I think as Pravda was also saying, like, to understand how gender works within these systems outside of the workplace is equally as important to think about. But I'd love to hear more about the construction piece, because I think it's hard to make those kinds of broad statements without understanding the specificity of particular market logics that function within these economies, right? And so construction, logistics, I don't know how similar they would be, but they definitely create these very specific relationships between gendered bodies and the workplace, but also the way that that functions in the realm of social reproduction.
Sabrina's making clear she didn't mean to limit it to construction, but thinking about, I guess, other areas outside of care. Adele, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so like Juan, I haven't focused my research on construction, but it seemed an awfully interesting way to bring in the migration parallels as well. So I would be interested in learning where you are looking. But when I think, you know, Qatar, for example, or if I think about the extent to which the work in movement Filipino men into an industry not unlike care work that is seen as located in the places to which the workers travel, and they carry or are recruited and carry with them the understandings over time that are historicized about the nature of that work. Then you wind up with a really important opportunity to think about the way in which core features of identity are operationalized within an understanding of capitalism that sorts and that frames and that conditions the kind of work that people do. And I've immediately drawn examples of cross-border migration. But if you're thinking in historicized ways, including about colonial patterns, you'll also think very carefully about rural urban migration for construction, for mining, for similar industries, and the ways in which the gendering and racialization combined to allow certain kinds of practices that are deeply exploitative to be normalized, right? To be inscribed in the bodies of the people who do that work. So, it's kind of saying the, I think, well-recognized point that analyses of that take gender and race seriously in relation to how we understand markets, understand that this operates across genders, and we get an incomplete picture if we don't take very seriously the work that is racialized and gendered male. Right.
I know that Prabha is asking some of those questions in her work too, and we have 6 minutes left, so I can't. This is on Beyond the Future of Work, so I do want to end with a future of work question, which is really about the need. Right? How do we need to get beyond the discourse the way we talk about it, and maybe just ask you all. I'll just ask, how might you imagine a future of work and livelihood that is not likely to become a repetition of the past or present? If that feels too utopian, you can change it however you like. But why don't we start with Aaron on that?
Okay, well, given very short time limits, I'll just say that in my view, the real task that we face is to create a world in which people are not insecure, basically, and that requires creating the kind of economy that meets everybody's needs without exception. And I think that ideas around universal basic income and universal basic services and different kinds of struggles for that and movements for it sort of begin to get at this idea that we already have the capacity with the technologies we currently possess to provide everyone with the means of living a decent life universally and without exception. And that is just what it means to kind of respond to the demand for dignity of all human beings. And that's the fundamental thing. And that the truly important realization is that doing so would require two other things. It would require, first, a dramatic transformation in work, because many people only go to work because they have to, on the pain of starvation and expulsion from their homes. And that doesn't have to be the case. We can redistribute the work that there is to do. We can make that work, we can transform that work so that it is intrinsically motivating, that it has a sense of purpose, that people have autonomy, that they can use and develop skills in their work, and that those things actually can support a vibrant economy that could actually meet the needs that people have, while also providing people with a lot of free time to pursue their passions. And that finally, doing that would require moving away from a world in which investment decisions that shape our economy and society are determined by a very small group of wealthy investors. And that requires moving to a world where investment decisions aren't based on profitability, but rather based on something like a form of democratic and participatory planning. And I think that there's been a real revival of interest, or beginnings of a revival of interest in this today. We live in a time, in the 1940s, we saw visions of full employment kind of, incorporating into the UN, the ILO, all of these documents founding the post-war order. In the 1970s, as that kind of, went into crisis, it was unfortunately replaced with visions of a kind of neoliberal active society in which everyone would be insecure and subordinated to the market. And somehow that was going to revive the growth that was lost and finally bring about development in the global South and equalize incomes and so on. And that was a huge disaster for the world. And now we live in a time of new visions. People are talking about Green New Deals and about new kinds of social compacts. And I think that it's really a time for visionary thinking about a possible world that really is a world of dignity, a world of satisfying and actually socially valuable work, and a world of shared participation in deciding where our resources go, not only to support, the building out or producing goods and services, as it were, but also using our resources to support a lot of the demands we've heard here: demands for dignity, demands for visibility, demands for reparations of past injustices, both locally and globally. And I think that that is totally a viable future, a future for work that we can actually achieve in the 21st century. Sorry to go on a little.
No, thank you. And influenced in part by your work, the question was livelihoods too. And we've tried to keep that very much on the table throughout the pop-up. So we could maybe Prabha, Adele, and we'll end with one. And there are a couple of questions in the chat now, but one of them from Ann Lewis, you could fold into your answers if it fits, because it's, does the future of work include self-organizing of workers in unions or other structures? And you could fit that into the same question about, does it look like the present and past? Prabha. And we do just have I do want to try to end no more than 5 minutes over.
Yeah, I'll be very short. I just want to share something, in the spirit of sort of a positive, upbeat story, and maybe it won't appear upbeat to everyone. But I think last year when I presented my paper on, the law's recognition of unpaid work, it just felt like an obscure tort law story. But actually, what has happened since is that in India, an actor who founded a political party promised salaries to homemakers. And I think initially he was met with a lot of ridicule, and people really thought, this person is really, completely out of whack with this proposal. And there were a lot of jokes about it. But actually, what happened very quickly was that these were state assembly elections, and pretty much every political party, rather than dismiss this newbie's idea, actually took it on board and very quickly reformulated this proposal of salaries for housework into, a range of policy proposals, whether it was pensions, whether it was minimum guaranteed income, whether it was gendered gendered basic income, or means-tested basic income funneled through a female head of household. It's just astonishing, the range of proposals that came through from the political parties. And to be honest, the public discourse around it was really amongst feminists. I think feminists had the most disagreement over the proposal. So I just want to say that sometimes, actually the culprits may not be the political parties who seem to be corrupt and out of touch with people. They actually, even without doing any calculations on the proposal, parties were willing to embrace it, not just to get votes. I think we should take their political instincts more seriously. They actually found that when they went on the ground campaigning, they found that women either needed it just to buy, a secondhand motorbike so that they didn't have to, travel, take public transport, or to buy their kids, branded T-shirts. I mean, whatever it was, the cushion that allowance, even if it was a modest amount, made was quite significant. Whereas I think for the feminists, it was much more naturally a question of, are we reinforcing gendered norms? So I think that was a very serious thing. But I think there can often be also elite resistance to sometimes quite democratic processes of aligning demands on the ground with policymakers who then kind of operationalize it in non-policy.
Yeah, and you can share the link to your website that has, I found, with a lot of the discussion about that, which is really fascinating, if you want, Prabha. Adele.
So thanks. I'll be super brief. I was at a symposium last week on reparations under international law, and Sir Hilary Beckles, Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, basically said, this is the century of redistribution, right? And really thinking that through. And in the spirit of that, in relation to care, I'd like to underscore Jenny Nadelsky's framing of how we might reimagine not just care, but our attachment to work. Here, I hear synergies with Aaron, because there is a deep undercurrent of how we democratize our relationship to the market. And that includes thinking very deeply about who should be doing the care work. And her answer is all of us. A real insistence on engaging with challenging our acceptance that, we talk about better pay, better this. Ultimately, if we're accepting that certain groups in our society will be attached to and subordinated in particular kinds of work, we are accepting the inequality. And it's a radical challenge to that. So that's part of a framing. And the second coming that so the redistribution happens in the way we understand care work's relationship to the market. But the north-south dimension is very much about rethinking. We frame our democratic understandings and our scope for redistribution in nation state frameworks that at their core maintain that same global inequality. If we are seriously thinking about redistribution, we need to be thinking deeply about the alternative spaces for imagining distribution. I've nodded to the regional, where I've spent a chunk of my work, and the social protection, the global social protection frameworks that flow through that. Interestingly, in this pandemic moment, there have been more calls for acknowledging that for a myriad of reasons. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who are thinking about the future of work to frame or reframe that in terms of a thickened understanding of what social justice demands.
Juan, you get the last word.
Thank you. This has really been great. And I'm really honored to be having this conversation with you all. I think for me, one of the things that I've focused my work on is just how it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, but it's an absolutely necessary thing to do, which is to think complex, in a very complex way, the ways in which the market, the ways in which the tenets of liberal democracy, the ways in which the idea of what the human condition is, have all been sort of put into work, right, for the sake of capitalism. And so we have this very complex system that expands not only within the workplace, but within society in general, that we really have to figure out how to undermine. So if we think about it, just the way that I write about technology is how technology has been used as kind of the hyper-rationalization of capitalist space. That the thinking about the technical fix as technology solving the problems of society, but they solve it, but it's incredibly, I mean, all the time, right? In terms of what we're thinking about, those problems and who asked the questions and what the problem is always for the benefit of expanding and growing capitalism. That's my whole point at the beginning. We're thinking about pervasiveness and the continuing logics of capitalism. So technology is continually used in order to fix society in place, to fix social relations in place in order to perpetuate certain kinds of market economies. And that includes things like the state. And all of this is an oversimplification. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but it gives us a sense to think about how pervasive these kinds of systems are. So capitalism used to continually create better ways, more efficient ways in order to make bodies into producers of value that can then be accumulated by the capitalist class, right? So that's what I mean by the technical fix. And so I think one of the things, and I think Aaron said this, is how do we reimagine work, right? How do we reimagine work into something that does not feed pandemic capitalism, right? And to me, I think that means that we have to then create social infrastructures where communities that are not seen as workers, but in fact do a lot of work in order to produce society and to reproduce society, can imagine radical futures and can begin to build those kinds of radical futures that are not based on technology as being the fix, right? Or being used to fix the accumulation problem for capitalists, where the state is not used to build the kinds of legal infrastructures and systems that then enable a certain kind of extractive economy to perform, where workers and people who cannot work or don't feel like working because the only reason that they have to is in order to participate in the system of private property accumulation and acquisition is because they have to work in certain jobs, doing certain things because they need to feed that kind of system, right? And so I do think that unions are absolutely part of this this process where people have to work. And so I write about how centering the voices of many of the workers that I've worked with has also said and shown us a way to think about social justice outside of the workplace, because they don't just imagine themselves as workers, see? And so I think that even that, I think, is part of thinking about a radical way to rethink how people see work in their life, right? They don't work or they don't exist in order to work. They work in order to exist. And that for me is a fundamentally problematic relationship when we think about the human, right? And humanity and what it means if we've structured and fixed in place all of these relationships in order to feed pandemic capitalism. Thank you.
All right, we have radical futures to imagine ahead. And thank you all for helping us do that twice, not just once, but I'm glad you got to meet each other and talk to each other if you hadn't already. So that was even a better conversation than I had fantasized. So the folks, I should say, a number of people wrote me and said they weren't able to attend today, but they're going to watch the video. So I think we've all sort of learned how to do that as time has gone by. It's as important to sign up to get the video. So we will be posting these, trying to get the turnaround in 2 or 3 days. And so know that that many people will get to take advantage of this discussion. And you're all invited to come back. That's everybody in this virtual room now who will join me in an applause. In whatever way they do that. And we look forward to seeing as many of you as are available for the Global Racial Capitalism's panel on Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
And I'll pass on a few other questions that came in along the way.
Bye.
Bye.